Hey class, today we're going to continue our study of the living world with the loss and conservation of biodiversity. You can see we'll be discussing invasive species, endangered species, and human impacts on biodiversity. Our background here shows some species that have sadly gone away from us on this planet. So we'll talk about what are some conditions that cause that to happen. To begin with, we need to know extinction is not just a man-made process. This is something that happens naturally. So it can be natural, right? So if you look at this, climate change, sea level, and ocean currents can change naturally. Certainly they can be influenced by humans, but it can also be natural factors that can cause some of this extinction to occur. One of the things we need to notice, though, is that since man, we've seen 1,000 times faster extinction than the background rate. So you'll see a diagram here we'll go through. There have been 5 mass extinctions. Our first mass extinction that we see from fossil records happened way back here, 500 million years ago. Then another one about 400 million. Then just before 300 million years ago, about 250 million years ago. And the last one was about 175 million years ago. So what we see when we move through this graph here is understanding that the mass extinction is a spike in the background rate. So when we look at fossil records and we see species that suddenly stop appearing in newer layers of our Earth, we make the decision that, like, hey, there's a lot of species here that disappeared. So you can see every time we have a spike, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we see this rise in extinction. The question of a 6th mass extinction being caused by humans on this planet, as these were all happening before humans were around, we start to see another rise here again, a lot of times contributed to our influence on this planet. So since man's been around, the extinction rate has increased 1,000 times more than our background rate of extinction. So we would expect to continue to see that sad trend unless we turn some things around here and stop harming our planet in some of the ways that we have been. Moving on, what makes a organism likely to go extinct, a species to go extinct? What are some vulnerable characteristics? Having a limited habitat is a really big one. If you aren't well suited for a lot of other places, that can be an issue. Having extremely specialized diet or niche, these are our specialist species that we discussed in class. If something goes wrong in what they're eating, they tend to run out of food or resources that they need. Low reproductive potential means they don't have a lot of babies. If they don't have a lot of babies, they don't reproduce quickly enough, they can be at risk. Migratory or require a large territory. They need a lot of land or they need to move. If something happens to the places they need to go, they're out of luck for habitat. Valuable economically, something like the rhino and its horn are hunted. That poaching can lead to these man-made declines in population and can make them very likely to go extinct. So we have this awesome acronym here to help you remember what are the causes of loss of biodiversity. What are the things that are going on to cause loss of biodiversity? Habitat destruction is the first one in our acronym of HIPPCO. You will see that on the top right here, and we'll kind of bounce through all the factors. So what can this look like? It can look like habitat degradation, fragmentation, or loss. These are all slightly different terms to describe how we destroy habitats. We can reduce the quality of the habitat through our interventions in building or pollution. We can do things like fragmentation, where we split a large area into many disconnected areas, or we can completely eliminate an entire habitat. So something like agriculture, we can see that we can take a habitat out, like a diverse grassland, and plant all wheat. We can fragment a habitat by putting a road in between. We've split our habitat into 2, and we can completely degrade a habitat by removing it entirely, or at least a significant portion. The I in HIPPCO is invasive species. Invasive species are species that are living outside their normal or natural range. Typically, humans are responsible for this, although not not always, but humans can bring them in either on purpose or by accident. Invasive species have these key characteristics, which we'll need to have down when we're trying to identify the problems they cause. First is fast growth and reproduction. They live in a variety of habitats, so they're very generalist. They usually are harmful to environments because they're generalists and they eat and outcompete. They get all these characteristics here. So they're really the opposite characteristics of vulnerable species, and these are, the generalist type characteristics that we see with organisms. The first P in HIPPCO is population, simply referring to the idea that as human populations grow, their demand for resources increases, and that infringes on the resources that our animals also need. The second P is pollution. Again, as human population grows, typically we produce more waste, and some of that waste is going into our environments, which is negatively impacting the biodiversity of our planet. The C is for climate change, obviously related to the last two with human population and pollution. We lead to warming temperatures that have the availability to kind of shift biomes, alter habitats, change conditions that might be favorable for some organisms, but definitely not favorable for others. And in doing so, we have a significant impact on the survival of species on this planet. The O is overharvesting. This could be overfishing or overhunting. We discussed those in a lot more detail later in the course. However, these are things we've seen before. The North American bison was almost hunted to extinction. The dodo was. The Tasmanian tiger was. So we've done it before. We almost did it again, and we'll continue to do it till we understand how important it is to monitor these populations and protect them. Single species conservation. So what do we do when we want to protect these species? Well, there's a single species approach that involves what a lot of people understand to be like a zoo or aquarium, right? Taking organisms and gathering them and just protecting them, keeping them safe, outside their environment is an example of that. We also have conservation legislation where we focus on single species like the Endangered Species Act. We want to identify a species and protect it and put laws in place for them. CITES is also this thing called Conservation International Trade and Endangered Species. CITES is really important because it takes these organisms and puts them in these three major appendices that we can categorize organisms as, right? So some, trade is permitted in 1, trade is really controlled in 2, and request for assistance in controlling the trade of the species is 3. All right. So it's really important to understand that they kind of set the stage for trying to prevent this illegal kind of black market demand for some of these organisms that had pressure. The last thing was that we've done for laws is a convention of biological diversity. The goals were conserve sustainable use and equity of sharing of biodiversity across nations, and the 2010 update is that kind of failed. It wasn't really well followed by the key countries that had put this in place. The IUCN Red List is a great resource for determining organisms and their ability to be classified as threatened, and how do we know organisms that need protecting. So the International Union for Conservation of Nature is responsible for that. They have these 7 criteria here that we should kind of draw and label out, so that kind of the worst case scenario here to least concern here, right? The threatened area is not where we want to be. So when we see organisms here, this demands some intervention for sure. So what do we look at? Things like population right now, trends in population, are they increasing, decreasing? Where do they live? What is the quality of the habitat in which they live? So we go from extinct to extinct in the wild, which means they're probably, if they're alive, they're in a zoo or aquarium, to the critically endangered, to the regular endangered, to the vulnerable. Those are all in the threatened category. Then we have near threatened organisms, and least concern is where we want to be. Sometimes you see data deficient, not evaluated, because we just don't have all the information on every organism on the planet. One of the things you'll hear me talk about is single large or several small. We give this the SLOSS acronym. you want to draw the pictures out here and have these 4 categories listed. So how do we determine the best way to conserve a species outside outside something like a zoo or aquarium in its normal environment, in situ conservation? So size is the first thing. So we ask ourselves, what's better as far as conservation goes? We want to look at a large being better than a small reserve. So a large reserve wins. More resources and more habitat availability is the main reason. The next one we'll look at is proximity. This proximity is like, if we're going to have multiple conservation areas, how do we know what's best? So is one large better, or are several small better? In this case, typically one large conservation area is better for the same reason, is that not only are there more resources, but they have more access to mating, breeding, and there's less outside the conservation area. They can be close together or far apart. Close together is better because if they do need to migrate, they're closer. And then we can have our shared habitat here as well, that these organisms are more clumped together than farther away in a linear fashion. Corridors is the next thing. Corridors are these linking kind of strips of land together. So those things are going to be able to kind of link them together and allow the organisms to travel together to these new areas, versus having no connection whatsoever puts them at risk while they're moving, and also less resources there as well. And then the shape, what's better for the shape of these conservation areas? Round is much better than something that's not round, so something like this. If you talk about any threat that may come from outside the area, there's just more edge here. There's more to concerns from the outside coming in, versus here there's more safety in the middle. So identifying areas for conservation, places where they have more biodiversity. These biodiversity hotspots are areas for conservation. Things like latitude, allowing organisms or places that are closer towards the equator, like our tropical rainforests, tend to have more biodiversity. So that's an area to be protected. Older ecosystems, mature habitats, larger habitats, things that are able to kind of get more bang for your buck when you're talking about conservation areas. We also see things with a couple of terms here we'll have to define, which is area where 2 habitats meet is an ecotone. An ecotone is simply just saying like 2 habitats. The overlap area, it's kind of like a Venn diagram in the middle, is the ecotone. Add an ecotone, we find this thing called the edge effect, where increase in biodiversity and resources occurs because we kind of get a little bit of forest and a little bit of grassland. So right in the middle, we can see this increase in biodiversity. So something like a marsh would be an example of that. And then land areas connecting, we just kind of discussed earlier, is a corridor. The idea that there's a connection between 2 areas that allows kind of for safe transport and travel for organisms in their conservation area.